They didn't announce it at a press conference. There was no breaking news ticker, no emergency broadcast, no government official standing at a podium telling the American public what the instruments had just recorded beneath Yellowstone National Park. The discovery came the way the most dangerous discoveries always come, quietly, in data, in numbers on a screen inside a monitoring station that most people don't know exists, watched by scientists whose job is to stare at signals that the rest of the world is not supposed to worry about. And then the numbers changed. 3 weeks ago, the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory published an update that used language it has not used in this combination before. A seismic swarm of unusual depth, ground deformation measurements that don't match the seasonal patterns on record, and a thermal anomaly reading from the Norris Geyser Basin, the hottest, most geologically unstable area in the entire Yellowstone caldera, that sits outside the standard deviation range the observatory uses as its baseline for normal. None of those things individually would be enough to lose sleep over. Yellowstone is one of the most monitored volcanic systems on Earth precisely because it is always doing something. Swarms, uplift, thermal pulses. These are the background noise of a supervolcano that has been brewing for 2 million years. But the combination, the timing, the specific location, that is what has the volcanology community quietly, carefully, and with the measured language of people who understand exactly what they are looking at, paying very close attention. Tonight on Project Nightwatch, we are going to walk through every piece of that data. We are going to explain what it means, what it doesn't mean, and why the distinction between those two things is the most important thing you will hear in this entire video. Before we begin, if this kind of deep, evidence-based coverage is what you come here for, hit like and subscribe. We don't do panic. We don't do clickbait. We do the work, and we show it to you straight. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And tell me this. Do you think the public deserves to be told the full truth about Yellowstone, even when that truth is uncertain? Drop that in the comments. I read everyone. Now, let's get into it. The Yellowstone Volcano Observatory publishes a monthly update. It has done this for years. The format is consistent. The language is technical, and for most of the past decade, the updates have read like variations on the same sentence. Activity within normal background ranges, no signs of unrest. The update released in the third week of April 2026 did not read like that. The document, publicly available, linked in the description, contains 3 data points that, read in isolation, each fall within the range of historically observed behavior at Yellowstone. But read together, in the context of where they occurred and over what time frame, they represent something that the observatory's own scientists describe using a word they use carefully. The word is anomalous. Let's take them one at a time. The first data point is seismic. Between March 29th and April 14th, the Yellowstone Seismic Network recorded a swarm of 1,247 earthquakes. That number by itself is not unusual. Yellowstone generates thousands of small earthquakes every year. Swarms are common. The 2017 Maple Creek swarm produced over 2,400 events. The system is seismically active by any standard. What is unusual about this swarm is its depth profile. The majority of Yellowstone earthquake swarms occur in the upper crust, between 2 and 8 kilometers below the surface. These shallow events are generally associated with hydrothermal fluid movement, essentially hot water and steam migrating through fractured rock, pushing against the walls of those fractures and occasionally slipping them. Normal, expected, logged, and filed. The April swarm was different. A significant subset of the events, approximately 340 of the 1,247 total, occurred at depths between 12 and 20 kilometers. That is below the brittle ductile transition zone. That is below the depth at which normal hydrothermal processes generate seismicity. That is the depth range where the partial melt zone, the magmatic system that powers the entire Yellowstone supervolcano, begins. Earthquakes at that depth do not come from water moving through rock. They come from something else. And the something else, in the context of a supervolcanic system, is a category of signal that gets scientists' full attention. The second data point is deformation. Yellowstone's surface moves constantly. The caldera floor has been inflating and deflating for decades in cycles that are reasonably well understood. GPS stations and satellite radar interferometry track these movements to millimeter precision. The system has an established seasonal pattern. Slight uplift in winter and spring as snowmelt adds pressure to the hydrothermal system. Slight subsidence in summer. The deformation date for the past 90 days does not match that pattern. The Norris GPS cluster, 4 stations positioned around the Norris Geyser Basin, has recorded net uplift of approximately 3 centimeters over a 90-day period. That rate is not unprecedented. The 2013-2014 uplift episode in the same area produced comparable measurements. But the 2013 to 2014 episode occurred during a period of elevated hydrothermal activity that had a clear surface expression. increased geyser discharge, elevated water temperatures, measurable ground heat flux changes. This episode does not have those surface expressions. The uplift is happening without the hydrothermal precursors that previously accompanied comparable deformation rates. The ground is rising. The usual explanation for why it rises is not fully accounting for the rate. The third data point is thermal. Satellite thermal imaging of the Norris Basin, conducted by a research team at the University of Utah in partnership with the observatory, shows a thermal anomaly approximately 340 meters in diameter that was not present in equivalent imagery from 18 months ago. The anomaly registers a surface temperature differential of 4.2 degrees Celsius above background. 4 degrees may not sound dramatic. In a different context, it wouldn't be. But in the geology of Yellowstone, a new 340-meter thermal feature that appears over an 18-month window, in a basin that is already the hottest surface expression of the magmatic system, in a location directly above a known hydrothermal upwelling zone. That is not background noise. That is a new signal. And the combination of those three signals, deep seismicity, anomalous uplift without hydrothermal surface expression, new thermal feature, emerging simultaneously in the same geographic area over the same time window, is what the observatory described as anomalous. And it is the reason we are here tonight. Was what they found the beginning of a reawakening? Or is it a perturbation in a system that has been behaving this way for 2 million years and will continue to do so for 2 million more? That question does not have an answer tonight. But by the time we are done, you will understand exactly why it doesn't, and why that uncertainty is itself the most important thing to understand about Yellowstone. Before we go any further into the data, we need to spend time on the thing itself, because Yellowstone is one of the most misunderstood geological features on Earth, and that misunderstanding cuts in both directions. Some people dismiss it entirely. They've heard the supervolcano label so many times attached to stories that turned out to be nothing, that the word has lost its meaning. They hear Yellowstone, they think sensationalism, they move on. Other people treat every geyser eruption as a harbinger, every swarm as imminent catastrophe, every USG's update as a government cover-up of something much worse. Both of those positions are wrong, and understanding why they're wrong requires understanding what Yellowstone actually is. Not as a cultural symbol or a conspiracy talking point, but as a geological system. Yellowstone sits above a mantle plume. A mantle plume is exactly what it sounds like, a column of unusually hot material rising from deep within the Earth's mantle, possibly from the boundary between the mantle and the outer core, approximately 2,900 kilometers below the surface. This plume has been driving volcanic activity in the region for at least 16 million years as the North American plate has slowly drifted over it, leaving a chain of ancient calderas stretching across southern Idaho. The Snake River Plain, like a scar written in basalt. The current expression of that plume is a magmatic system beneath Yellowstone that has been mapped in unprecedented detail over the past decade. And what the mapping revealed is more complex and more substantial than most people realize. Directly beneath the Yellowstone caldera, at depths between 5 and 17 kilometers, sits a shallow magma reservoir. This reservoir is not a lake of liquid rock, as it is sometimes depicted. It is a partially molten zone, a sponge-like mass of hot crystalline rock with pockets of melt distributed through it. Current estimates based on seismic tomography suggest the melt fraction is somewhere between 5 and 15% of the total volume. Below that shallow reservoir, at depths between 20 and 50 kilometers, sits a second, larger magma body. This lower crustal body contains significantly more melt than the shallow reservoir and acts as the primary heat source driving the entire system. And below that, feeding both reservoirs from below, is the mantle plume itself, a column of anomalously hot material that has been delivering heat to this system continuously for millions of years and shows no signs of stopping. The total volume of the combined magmatic system is enormous. The shallow reservoir alone is estimated at approximately 4,000 cubic kilometers. The lower crustal body adds perhaps another 0 cubic kilometers of partially molten material. The mantle plume itself represents a source of heat that dwarfs anything the upper crust contains. To put those numbers in context, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which killed 57 people, destroyed 250 homes, and blew 400 meters off the top of the mountain, released approximately 1 cubic kilometer of magma. 1. The Yellowstone shallow reservoir contains roughly 4,000 times that amount of magmatic material. The 3 major Yellowstone eruptions in the past 1 million years released volumes that are almost incomprehensible on the scale of human experience. The oldest, the Huckleberry Ridge Eruption 1 million years ago, released approximately 2,500 cubic kilometers of material. The Mesa Falls Eruption 3 million years ago, released 280 cubic kilometers. The Lava Creek eruption 640 zillion years ago, which created the current Yellowstone caldera, released approximately 1,000 cubic kilometers. For comparison, the 1815 eruption of Tambora in Indonesia, the largest eruption in recorded human history, which killed an estimated 71,000 people directly and contributed to the year without a summer in 1816, causing crop failures across the northern hemisphere, released approximately 160 cubic kilometers. The Lava Creek eruption was more than 6 times larger than that, and it was not the biggest Yellowstone eruption on record. This is what we are talking about when we talk about Yellowstone. Not a large volcano, a system capable of eruptions that operate on a scale that can alter global climate, deposit ash across an entire continent, and reshape the geography of North America. That is the geological reality beneath the national park. The hot springs, the geyser, Old Faithful, these are not tourist attractions that happen to sit above an interesting geological feature. They are the surface expression of a magmatic system that represents one of the most consequential geological hazards on the planet. Was what the observatory detected in April the beginning of something? Or is it noise in a system that routinely produces noise? To answer that question, we need to understand what the system looked like the last time it woke up. The 3 super eruptions are the events that get the most attention. They are the ones that define the caldera, the ones that deposited volcanic ash as far east as Iowa and as far south as Texas, the ones that represent the scale of what this system is theoretically capable of. But the history of Yellowstone is not just 3 eruptions followed by silence. It is a continuous story of geological unrest that has been playing out for 2 million years, and parts of that story are directly relevant to what the instruments are showing right now. After the Lava Creek supereruption 640,000 years ago, Yellowstone did not go quiet. It entered a long period of smaller but still significant volcanic activity, rhyolite lava flows, hydrothermal explosions, dome formations. More than 30 distinct rhyolite lava flow events have been identified within the current caldera over the past 640,000 years. The most recent of these occurred approximately 70,000 years ago. In geological terms, that is not long ago at all. Those lava flows are important for several reasons. They tell us that between supereruptions, the Yellowstone system is capable of smaller but still significant eruptive events. They tell us that magmatic material has reached the surface repeatedly in the current caldera's lifetime, and they tell us that the system does not need to produce a supereruption to be dangerous. A rhyolite lava flow event at Yellowstone, even a relatively small one by the system's historical standards, would be a catastrophic event by any human measure. But there is another category of Yellowstone hazard that sits between small thermal events and supereruptions. One that receives far less attention than either extreme, and one that the current anomalous data makes directly relevant. Hydrothermal explosions. Yellowstone has produced numerous large hydrothermal explosions in the post-glacial period, the past 14,000 years. These are not volcanic eruptions in the traditional sense. They do not involve magma directly. They are caused when superheated water at extreme depth suddenly flashes to steam with enough explosive force to excavate craters hundreds of meters in diameter. The largest of these events in the relatively recent past was the Mary Bay explosion, approximately 13,800 years ago. It excavated a crater nearly 5 kilometers across on the northern shore of Yellowstone Lake. The explosion was triggered when the sudden retreat of glacial ice removed an enormous pressure load from the hydrothermal system, essentially uncorking a bottle that had been sealed for thousands of years. More recently, and this is the part that is directly relevant to the current data, the Porkchop Geyser hydrothermal explosion of 1989 occurred with essentially no warning. An area of the Norris Geyser Basin that had been monitored for years suddenly exploded, scattering rocks up to 220 meters from the center and leaving a crater 6 meters across. No one was injured, only because no visitors happened to be standing in the immediate area. Norris Geyser Basin, the same location where the current thermal anomaly has been detected. This is not a coincidence worth dismissing. The Norris Basin is consistently the most geologically unstable surface feature in the entire Yellowstone system. It sits above a zone of crustal weakness where hydrothermal fluids from depth have direct pathways to the surface. It is the area most sensitive to changes in the deep magmatic system, and it is the area where every significant surface change in Yellowstone's recent history has manifested first. When Norris changes, it means something has changed below Norris. The question is always how deep the change originates and what is driving it. The 2003 Norris thermal disturbance closed portions of the basin for the first time in park history due to ground temperatures so high that they were melting the asphalt on boardwalks. The 2007-2008 uplift episode centered on Norris produced vertical ground motion of approximately 10 centimeters. In both cases, the disturbances resolved without escalating to eruptive activity, but both of those episodes were preceded by clear hydrothermal surface signals: elevated geyser activity, ground temperature increases, visual changes in the thermal features. The current episode, as I noted when we examined the deformation data, is not showing those same surface signals. The uplift is happening. The deep seismicity is happening. The thermal anomaly has appeared. But the hydrothermal system at the surface is not behaving the way it behaved before the 2003 and 2008 episodes. That difference matters, and understanding why it matters requires understanding the plumbing system that connects the deep magmatic source to the surface. Was what the observatory detected in April the beginning of something? Or is it a perturbation in a system that has produced dozens of similar perturbations over the past 2 million years, none of which led to catastrophic eruption? The answer depends on what is driving the signal, and to understand that, we need to go down. The Yellowstone magmatic system does not connect directly to the surface. Between the shallow magma reservoir at 5 to 17 kilometers depth and the hydrothermal features visible at Yellowstone's surface, there is a complex network of fractures, fault zones, hydrothermal conduits, and pressure vessels that collectively constitute what geologists call the hydrothermal system. Think of it this way. The magma reservoir is the furnace. The hydrothermal system is the radiator. Heat from the furnace transfers into groundwater, circulating through the fractured rock above it. That heated water, some of it superheated to temperatures well above 300 degrees Celsius under the enormous pressure of the overlying rock, rises through the conduit system toward the surface, where it emerges as geysers, hot springs, mud pots, and fumaroles. Old Faithful is not powered by a simple pipe connecting to a magma chamber. It is powered by a specific geometry of fractures and a subsurface reservoir of superheated water that fills, pressurizes, and discharges on a cycle determined entirely by the local hydrology and heat flux. Change the heat flux, change the pressure, change the fracture geometry, and the geyser changes. The connection between deep magmatic processes and surface thermal features is therefore not direct or immediate. Changes at depth propagate upward through the hydrothermal system on timescales that can range from days to decades, depending on the nature of the change and the specific pathways available. This is why the current anomaly is so puzzling to the scientists monitoring it. The standard model for Yellowstone unrest goes like this. Magmatic intrusion or pressurization at depth causes deformation of the overlying rock. That deformation opens new fractures or pressurizes existing conduits. The hydrothermal system responds. Fluids migrate, pressures change, surface features activate or intensify. GPS stations record the ground rising. Seismicity increases as fluids push through fractures. Geysers erupt more frequently. Ground temperatures rise. The whole system announces itself from the top down as the disturbance propagates upward, through the plumbing. The April 2026 signals do not follow that model cleanly. The deep seismicity is there. The deformation is there. The thermal anomaly is there. But the intermediate layer, the hydrothermal system connecting depth to surface, is not showing the activation pattern that the standard model would predict. There are 3 possible explanations for this, and each has very different implications. The first explanation is that the deep signals are driven by hydrothermal processes that are operating in a part of the system that doesn't have good conduit pathways to the surface. In other words, fluids are moving at depth, causing the deformation and seismicity, but the specific fracture network above the active zone does not efficiently transmit those signals upward to the surface hydrothermal features. The system's active below, quiet above, not because something unusual is happening, but because this particular part of the plumbing is sealed. This explanation is consistent with the data and represents the least concerning interpretation. It would suggest a hydrothermal episode of moderate significance that will likely resolve without major surface disruption. The second explanation is that the deep signals reflect a small increase in heat or fluid flux from the magma reservoir, not intrusion of new magma, but a pulse of magmatic gases or thermal energy from the existing reservoir entering the base of the hydrothermal system. This would cause the deformation and seismicity we are observing. The reason the surface hydrothermal features haven't responded yet could simply be lag time. The pulse is working its way up through the system and hasn't arrived at the surface yet. Under this explanation, what the observatory is observing now is the leading edge of a disturbance that hasn't fully manifested at the surface. The surface response is coming. When it arrives, it will likely look like elevated geyser activity, increased ground temperatures at Norris, possible changes to the thermal features. It will probably resolve without eruptive activity, consistent with historical precedent, but it would represent a genuine pulse from the magmatic system, a real signal from depth, not just noise in the hydrothermal plumbing. The third explanation is the one that scientists are not ruling out, but but are not ready to state publicly in unqualified terms. It is the explanation that requires the most care to present accurately. The third explanation is that the deep seismicity reflects actual movement of magmatic material, not a pulse of gas or thermal energy, but a physical migration of partially molten rock from the shallow reservoir into a zone it has not previously occupied in the monitoring era. A small intrusion, not an eruption, not an imminent catastrophe, but a genuine reorganization of the magmatic system at depth. Magmatic intrusions occur at volcanic systems around the world without leading to eruptions. They are, in fact, far more common than eruptions. The ratio of intrusive events to eruptive events at most volcanoes is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 to 1. Magma moves, pressurizes, fails to find a pathway to the surface, cools and solidifies. The eruption never happens. But intrusions are also the mechanism by which eruptions are set up. Every eruption is preceded by intrusion. The question is never whether intrusion is occurring. Magma systems are always in slow motion. The question is whether a specific intrusion event represents a step toward eruption or a step toward solidification. And the instruments we have today cannot reliably tell those two pathways apart in the early stages. Was what the observatory found in April a hydrothermal pulse, a thermal gas flush from depth, or the opening movements of a magmatic intrusion? The answer to that question will determine everything about how this story ends. And the only way to begin answering it is to understand what the monitoring network can and cannot see. Yellowstone is the most monitored supervolcanic system on Earth. The Yellowstone Volcano Observatory operates a network that includes more than 50 seismograph stations, 12 continuous GPS stations supplemented by satellite radar interferometry, a series of stream gauge and temperature monitoring stations that track hydrothermal output, ground-based thermal cameras, and satellite-based multispectral imaging. This is not a system being watched from a distance with inadequate tools. The monitoring network has been continuously upgraded for 2 decades. The data resolution it provides today is orders of magnitude better than what was available during the unrest episodes of the 1970s and 1980s, and yet, there are things it cannot see. The fundamental limitation of volcano monitoring is the same limitation that constrains seismology and every other attempt to read the internal state of a geological system from the outside. The critical processes are happening kilometers below the surface, in rock at temperatures and pressures that no instrument can access directly. Everything we know about the state of the magmatic system is inferred from surface and near-surface measurements, run through physical models, and interpreted through the filter of what we know about how similar systems have behaved historically. That inferential chain has weaknesses at every link. The seismic network can detect earthquakes down to approximately magnitude 0. 5 within the caldera. It can locate them in 3 dimensions to within a few hundred meters horizontally and a kilometer or so vertically. It can characterize their focal mechanisms, the pattern of motion on the fault that produced them, which provides information about the stress, field, and the direction of fluid pressure. What it cannot do is tell you definitively whether a cluster of earthquakes at 15 kilometers depth was caused by a hydrothermal fluid or a magmatic fluid. Both produce seismicity. Both produce earthquakes with similar characteristics. The distinction requires geochemical data, analysis of gas emissions and groundwater chemistry that takes time to collect and interpret, and that provides only an indirect window into what is happening at the actual depth of the seismicity. The GPS and satellite deformation data can tell you that the ground is moving and at what rate. It can tell you the spatial pattern of that movement, whether it is broad and dome-like, suggesting a distributed pressure source, or narrow and focused, suggesting a localized intrusion. The current uplift pattern at Norris is, according to the observatory's preliminary analysis, broader than would be expected from a localized intrusion, but narrower than the previous caldera-wide deformation episodes. What the deformation data cannot tell you is what is causing the pressure change at depth: an expanding body of magmatic gas, a pocket of supercritical hydrothermal fluid, a small intrusion of partially molten rock, a migration of the existing melt within the reservoir. All of these can produce deformation signatures that overlap. The thermal imaging data is perhaps the most direct window into near-surface processes, but it only sees the top few meters of the ground. A thermal anomaly at the surface tells you that something at or near the surface has changed. Either the heat flux from below has increased, or the hydrothermal plumbing geometry has shifted to concentrate heat in a new area. It does not tell you why the heat flux increased or how far down the change originates. This is the epistemic situation the scientists at the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory are in right now. They have excellent data. They have the best monitoring network in the world for this system. And the data they are looking at is telling them that something has changed, that the combination of deep seismicity, anomalous deformation, and new thermal features represents a departure from recent background behavior, but the data is not telling them what caused the change. And in the gap between something changed and here is what caused it, sits the entire range of possible interpretations. From hydrothermal pulse, nothing to worry about, to magmatic intrusion of uncertain significance. The scientists will narrow that range over the coming weeks and months as more data comes in, as gas chemistry measurements are analyzed, as the aftershock patterns of the swarm are examined in detail, as the deformation data shows whether the uplift is continuing, accelerating, or decelerating. But right now, in this moment, the range is wide, and that wide range is not a failure of science. It is what honest science looks like in real time, when it is confronting a system that has been operating for 2 million years and has never produced a super eruption during the period of human instrument monitoring. Was what they found the beginning of something, or background variation in a system too complex to fully characterize? To understand where the current data sits on the historical spectrum, we need to look at the last time Yellowstone showed signs of waking up, and what those signs actually meant. The most significant Yellowstone unrest episode in the modern monitoring era began in 2004 and continued through 2010, with the most intense activity concentrated between 2007 and 2008. During that period, the caldera floor uplifted at rates approaching 7 centimeters per year, fast enough that researchers described it as the highest deformation rate observed since systematic GPS monitoring began. The episode was centered on the northern part of the caldera, in the same broad geographic area as the current anomaly. It involved multiple seismic swarms, the largest of which in December 2008 produced over 900 earthquakes in a single week, with the largest event reaching magnitude 3.9. The observatory monitored it closely. Papers were published. The scientific community debated the cause. The consensus interpretation that emerged over several years of analysis was that the episode was driven by a large-scale influx of hydrothermal fluids, superheated water, and magmatic gases from the deep magmatic system into the hydrothermal reservoir above it. Not magma intrusion, not a precursor to eruption, a fluid pulse. That interpretation was reassuring, and it appeared to be validated when the uplift episode ended and the caldera began to subside again, consistent with a pressure pulse that had dissipated rather than a sustained injection of new magmatic material that would maintain or increase pressure. But not everyone in the volcanological community fully accepted the hydrothermal fluid interpretation. A minority position, represented in peer-reviewed literature, argued that the deformation pattern was more consistent with a partial intrusion of magmatic material into the shallow crust below the caldera. Not enough to drive eruption, but enough to represent genuine movement of the magmatic system. The debate was never fully resolved because the data, even with the excellent monitoring network, didn't cleanly discriminate between the two interpretations. Both models fit the observations within their respective uncertainties. That unresolved debate is directly relevant to the current situation because it means that the 2007-2008 episode, the best analog we have for what is being observed now, itself has an ambiguous interpretation. We don't fully know what caused it, which means we can't simply point to it and say the current episode is just like 2008 and therefore equally benign. There is another historical episode that deserves attention here. It is less well-known outside the volcanological community, but represents perhaps the most direct analog for the specific combination of signals being observed right now. In 1978, Yellowstone entered a period of elevated seismicity and ground deformation that lasted approximately 18 months. During this episode, deep seismicity, similar in depth profile to the current swarm, was accompanied by ground uplift and the appearance of several new thermal features in the Norris Basin. The scientific community at the time, working with much more limited monitoring capabilities, interpreted the episode as a moderate hydrothermal disturbance. What subsequent analysis revealed, work published years later as better data became, was that the 1978 episode likely involved a small intrusion of magmatic material into the shallow crust beneath Norris. Not the main magma reservoir, not a large volume, but actual magma in a new position closer to the surface than it had previously been documented. The intrusion cooled, it did not erupt. The episode ended. Yellowstone returned to background behavior. But that episode left a record in the subsurface. A frozen intrusion, a body of solidified igneous rock at relatively shallow depth beneath Norris, that is detectable in the current seismic tomography images of the system. It is a scar in the crust that marks where the system tested a pathway toward the surface and failed to complete the journey. The question being asked quietly among scientists studying the current data is whether April 2026 represents something similar. A system testing a pathway, magmatic material or magmatic fluids probing the crust above the reservoir, not an eruption. Not necessarily even a close call, but a real signal from a real source. a pulse from the engine of Yellowstone. Was what the observatory found in April a message from the system about what it is doing right now? And if so, what is the system saying? One of the most important concepts in volcanology is the difference between unrest and escalation. They are not the same thing, and treating them as equivalent is one of the most common errors in public coverage of volcanic hazards. Unrest is the normal state of an active volcanic system. Yellowstone is always in unrest to some degree. Seismicity, deformation, hydrothermal activity, these are the constant expressions of a system that is alive. Unrest does not imply eruption. It implies activity. The two are not the same. Escalation is something different. Escalation is when the measures of unrest, seismicity rates, deformation magnitude, thermal output, begin to increase over time rather than fluctuate around a stable mean. It is when the system shows a directional trend, a progressive intensification, rather than the quasi-random variation of background activity. The distinction matters because the pathway to eruption runs through escalation, not through unrest. A volcano that has been in moderate unrest for decades and shows no escalating trend is not meaningfully approaching eruption, regardless of what it is doing on any given day. A volcano that shows a clear escalating trend, increasing seismicity, accelerating deformation, rising thermal output, is in a fundamentally different state, regardless of its current absolute level of activity. Where does Yellowstone sit on that spectrum right now? Honestly, and I want to be precise here because precision matters, the current data is not yet sufficient to make that determination. The April swarm is a single data point. The deformation episode is 90 days old. The thermal anomaly is measured against an 18-month baseline. To determine whether the system is escalating or simply showing elevated variation, you need a longer time series. You need to see whether the seismicity rate after the April swarm is returning toward background or maintaining its elevated level. You need to see whether the deformation is continuing, accelerating, or decelerating. You need to see whether the thermal anomaly is expanding, stabilizing, or contracting. That data is being collected right now. It will take weeks to months to interpret meaningfully. What we can say is this: the April signals represent the highest combination of simultaneous anomalous indicators at Yellowstone's since the 2007-2008 episode. 3 independent monitoring systems, all showing departures from recent background behavior, in the same location, at the same time. In the history of the monitoring era, that specific combination has not previously led to eruptive activity. But the monitoring era, the period of systematic high-quality instrumental monitoring, covers approximately 40 years. The system has been active for 2 million years. The 40-year monitoring record is not a complete picture of what this system is capable of doing between its century-scale unrest episodes. The volcanologists watching Yellowstone tonight are not panicking. They are doing what the science requires: collecting data, building interpretations, holding multiple hypotheses simultaneously, and resisting the very human pressure to arrive at a definitive conclusion before the evidence supports one. But they are watching carefully, and the fact that they are watching carefully is information. Was what the observatory found in April a sign of escalation, or a temporary elevation in a system that will return to baseline? The answer to that question will start to become clearer in the next 30 to 60 days, and what it reveals will determine whether we are covering a geological curiosity or the opening chapter of the most consequential volcanic story in recorded human history. At this point in the video, I want to do something that most Yellowstone coverage does not do. I want to give you the actual eruption scenarios. Not the Hollywood version, not the catastrophist version, not the dismissive version, the scientific version. What volcanologists actually think the range of possible Yellowstone eruptive outcomes looks like, based on the geological record and the current state of the system. There are 4 distinct scenarios, and they are not equally likely. Scenario 1, a hydrothermal explosion. This is by far the most probable eruptive scenario at Yellowstone in the near term, and it is the scenario most directly relevant to the current Norris anomaly. A hydrothermal explosion does not involve magma reaching the surface. It is driven by the sudden vaporization of superheated groundwater when the pressure confining it is suddenly reduced, either by a seismic event that opens new fractures, or by a rapid decrease in the water table, or by the spontaneous failure of the pressure vessel containing the superheated fluid. Historical hydrothermal explosions at Yellowstone have ranged from the 1989 pork chop event, small, localized, no casualties, to the massive Mary Bay event 13,800 years ago, which excavated a crater 2.5 kilometers across. The most dangerous credible near-term scenario at Norris Basin would be an explosion producing a crater roughly 500 to 1,000 meters in diameter. This would be catastrophic within the immediate blast zone, potentially kilometers of lethal radius from the initial explosion. It would generate a pyroclastic surge that would kill anything within its reach. It would likely trigger secondary hydrothermal events in the basin, but it would not be a global or even a regional catastrophe. It would not produce significant tephra fall outside the park. It would not affect climate. It would be an extreme local geological hazard, comparable in its consequences to a moderate volcanic eruption at a more conventional volcano. The probability of this scenario within the next decade is considered low but non-trivial by the observatory. The current data at Norris does not directly indicate imminent hydrothermal explosion, but the combination of elevated deep heat flux and the existing thermal anomaly means the hydrothermal system in the Norris area is operating with less margin than it was 18 months ago. Scenario 2. A rhyolite lava flow eruption. This is a volcanic eruption involving silicic magma reaching the surface. Not the gentle Hawaiian-style lava flows you might visualize, but a highly viscous, gas-rich magma that erupts more explosively than basaltic lava and can produce significant pyroclastic material. The most recent Yellowstone eruptions, the lava flows of 70,000 years ago, were of this type. A rhyolite lava flow eruption at Yellowstone today would be a significant regional disaster. Depending on the location within the caldera, it could threaten the park itself, surrounding communities, and, through ash fall from the explosive component of the eruption, potentially affect an area of several hundred kilometers downwind. The precursors to this type of eruption would be extensive and visible. The deformation would be dramatic, meters of uplift over relatively short timescales. Seismicity would be intense and shallowing progressively toward the surface. Gas emissions would increase dramatically. There would be no ambiguity in the signal. The monitoring network would have weeks to months of clear warning. The current data does not show anything approaching the precursors for this scenario. If the current anomaly represents a small magmatic intrusion, the most concerning reasonable interpretation of the current data, it is at the very beginning of a process that would require a sustained and dramatic escalation over months to years before this scenario became credible. Scenario 3. A caldera-forming supereruption. This is the scenario that captures cultural imagination. The full-scale Yellowstone supereruption that fills the popular media cycle every few years. A magnitude 8 or larger eruption releasing hundreds to thousands of cubic kilometers of magma, depositing volcanic ash across the continental United States, potentially affecting global climate. The current probability of this scenario occurring in the near term, meaning the next century, is, according to the Yuskies and the scientific consensus, extremely low. The estimate typically cited is approximately 1 in 730,000 per year. To put that in context, it is lower than the annual probability of being struck by lightning in the United States. Why is it so low? Several reasons. First, the melt fraction in the shallow reservoir is well below the 35 to 45% threshold that most models suggest is necessary for a supereruption to initiate. Second, the roof rock above the reservoir, the crystalline rock that the magma would need to fracture and displace to reach the surface, is in a state of stress that does not favor rapid upward propagation of a magmatic column. Third, the current level of heat flux from the deep system, while elevated above recent background, is not dramatically different from what the system has shown during previous unrest episodes that resolved without eruption. A supereruption from Yellowstone is not off the table on geological timescales. The system has done it before, and the mantle plume is still there. But on human timescales, decades, centuries, it is not the scenario that the current data is pointing toward. Scenario 4, continued unrest without eruption. This is not a scenario that gets named in most coverage, but it is, by a significant margin, the most likely outcome of any Yellowstone unrest episode, including this one. The system continues to show elevated activity. The monitoring agencies continue to watch. The data eventually clarifies whether the anomaly represents a transient hydrothermal pulse or a more sustained magmatic signal. The system adjusts, activity declines, the episode ends. This is what happened in 2004-2010, in 1978-1979. In 1959, following the Hebgen Lake earthquake, which produced the largest seismic event in the Yellowstone region in the modern era at magnitude 7.2 and triggered significant changes to Yellowstone's geothermal features. In every significant unrest episode in the monitoring era, Yellowstone has not erupted. The current episode is statistically most likely to follow the same pattern. Was what the observatory found in April a step toward eruption? Or another episode in a long series of episodes that will resolve without breaking? The surface? The most honest answer, grounded in everything the science knows and acknowledges about what it doesn't know, is probably the latter. But probably is not certainly, and the gap between probably and certainly is where the advisory, the monitoring, and the science live. Within hours of any new Yellowstone data being published, certain corners of the internet produce a predictable response. Government cover-up, The real numbers are worse than what they're telling us. The animals are fleeing the park. There was a nuclear test. They've been seeding the clouds. The deep state needs a distraction. HARP, the Illuminati built it. NASA knows something we don't. I wanted to address this directly because I think the people asking these questions, many of them, anyway, are not acting in bad faith. They are people who have learned, often from hard experience, that institutions do not always tell the full truth. They are people who have seen real conspiracies, real government deceptions, real corporate malfeasance, real institutional failures of transparency. Their skepticism is not irrational as a general posture, but the specific conclusions they reach about Yellowstone are wrong, not slightly off, not missing some nuance, wrong in ways that the physics makes non-negotiable. Let's take the animal evacuation claim first, because it is the one that resurfaces most reliably. The video of bison running out of the park, the story that the animals sense something coming and are fleeing. The specific bison video that circulates periodically was filmed in 2014. It was a herd of bison running into the park, toward Yellowstone, not away from it. It was not fleeing. It was doing what bison do in spring, moving to lower elevations as winter grazing areas open up. It has been debunked repeatedly. It keeps resurfacing because it is visually dramatic and fits a narrative. The fact that it keeps resurfacing after repeated debunking tells you something important about how the conspiracy information ecosystem works. The cover-up claim that the USGS is downplaying the actual severity of what the instruments are showing runs into a specific logistical problem. The Yellowstone Monitoring Network is not a government secret. The data from the seismic network, the GPS stations, and the ground deformation measurements is publicly archived and available for download. Researchers at universities around the world analyze this data independently. The instruments are not controlled by a single agency with the ability to suppress their readings. If the true seismicity at Yellowstone were dramatically higher than what the USGS reports, the independent seismic networks operated by universities would show it. They do not. If the actual deformation were dramatically greater than the reported values, the satellite radar interferometry data, processed by multiple independent research groups in multiple countries, would show it. It does not. The claim that Yellowstone is about to erupt and the government is hiding it requires not a single institution operating in bad faith, but dozens of independent scientific institutions in multiple countries, all simultaneously suppressing the same data. The conspiracy would have to be larger and more perfectly coordinated than any conspiracy in human history to function. What about HARP and artificial triggering? We covered the physics of this in detail during our Japan earthquake coverage, but the Yellowstone version is worth addressing directly. The energy required to trigger a Yellowstone supereruption, to push a partially molten system with a melt fraction of 5 to 15% over the threshold of eruptive instability, would be in the range of hundreds to thousands of times the total annual electricity generation of the United States. There is no weapon system, no directed energy platform, no technology that exists or has been seriously proposed that comes within orders of magnitude of that energy requirement. Yellowstone is not being triggered by external forces. It is being driven by a mantle plume that has been operating for 16 million years and requires no human assistance to continue doing what it does. The real story of Yellowstone, a genuine supervolcanic system showing genuine anomalous signals that genuine scientists are genuinely concerned about, is more interesting, more important, and more worth your attention than any conspiracy theory. Because the real story requires you to hold uncertainty without collapsing it into false certainty in either direction. It requires you to be comfortable not knowing the answer while understanding exactly why you don't know it. That is harder than believing in a cover-up. But it is true. The observatory is not watching and waiting passively. The anomalous data has triggered a specific set of enhanced monitoring protocols that will produce new information over the coming weeks and months. Gas geochemistry sampling has been intensified at Norris and at several other points around the caldera. This involves collection and analysis of volcanic gases, primarily carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and helium, from fumaroles and thermal features. The ratio of different gases, and in particular the helium isotope ratio, the ratio of helium-3 to helium-4, is one of the most diagnostic indicators available for distinguishing between deep magmatic sources and shallower hydrothermal sources. Helium-3 is a primordial gas that originates in the mantle. Helium-4 is produced by the radioactive decay of uranium and thorium in crustal rocks. When a volcanic system shows an increase in the helium-3 to helium-4 ratio, it means more mantle-derived gas is entering the system from below, a direct chemical fingerprint of magmatic activity at depth. If the gas chemistry at Norris shows an elevated helium-3 signal over the coming weeks, that will be strong evidence that the current anomaly has a magmatic source. If it does not, if the gas chemistry remains consistent with a hydrothermal source, that will be evidence for the less concerning interpretation. The results of that sampling will probably be available within 4 to 6 weeks of the collection date. They will not be broadcast on CNN. They will be published in the monthly observatory update and in the scientific literature. But they will be there, available to anyone who knows to look for them. The seismicity pattern over the next 30 days will also be highly informative. If the April swarm was the acute phase of the episode and seismicity rates are now returning toward background, that is a reassuring signal. If seismicity remains elevated or increases, particularly if deep events continue to occur, that maintains the elevated concern. The deformation data is being monitored continuously. The critical question is whether the uplift rate is decelerating, indicating the pressure source at depth is dissipating, or whether it is maintaining or accelerating. A decelerating uplift signal over the next 30 to 60 days would be the single most reassuring data point the observatory could produce. And the thermal feature at Norris is being tracked with monthly satellite overpasses and weekly ground-based measurements. If it stabilizes in area and temperature differential, that indicates a new equilibrium rather than ongoing escalation. If it expands, particularly if it shows any signs of ground fracturing or new hydrothermal feature formation, that would indicate the system is still actively changing at near-surface depths. All of this data is coming. None of it is hidden. The story of Yellowstone in 2026 will be told in millimeters of ground motion and parts per million of gas chemistry and fractions of a degree of surface temperature. It will not be told in dramatic announcements from government officials, and that is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell.